Welcome to the Teachers of BC podcast. Real stories, real teachers, real life. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Indigenous people of British Columbia. Haichka.
Welcome to another episode of Teachers of BC podcast. Real teachers, real stories, real life. This is a two-part series, and it really came about because the podcast crew and I wanted to address the severe increase in teacher burnout rate that is happening in our province, and also the increase in teachers taking time off work for mental health reasons. We really wanted to start the conversation about teacher mental health. So, in part one, we are going to focus on what we can do in the moment, in the classroom, when we start to feel overwhelmed, but we have a class of 30 students that we are still responsible for. Today, I am joined not only by my best friend, but also a trained counsellor and a new mother to two gorgeous baby girl twins, who you will probably hear in the background as they are also joining us here today. So look out for those cameos. So Jill, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Jillian Schultz, and I currently work for Vancouver Coastal Health, and I'm a concurrent disorders clinician. Essentially what that means is I work with individuals that are struggling with substance use issues and mental health. And my background has been primarily in that field, and I'm also a music teacher. And I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here today and being part of this really important discussion. So as I said previously, there is an alarming increase in teacher burnout rate. And as you know from the many stories I have told you, you know that teachers have a lot of stresses. So this first topic I would love to discuss with you is essentially what can we do as teachers to cope with the stresses that we may have in the classroom?
Sure. And what we want to almost ask ourselves first is, well, what is going on that's causing that? The more that you understand your environment and the triggers that are in that environment for you personally and just naturally for all teachers, the better you'll be able to understand how to help yourself cope, both in the classroom and then also outside of the workplace once you're home. Essentially, there's two ways to go about that, right? Because you want to make sure that you have a good work-life balance, but also how do I cope in the classroom as well when things are stressful and things come up? So we want to almost do it in two parts, essentially. Are you looking after yourself once you get off work? What does that look like? And what's going on when you're at work as well? And are there things that we could be doing a better job at school, both as ourselves personally and as the system, to help manage that? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I especially for me, gosh, I always feel like I'm giving.
Right.
I always feel like I have about 10 million things to do, and I also feel like I have about 5 million questions and needs coming at me. And we wear so many different hats that it's sometimes a lot to juggle.
Right.
In the classroom. Yeah.
And that's precisely what I think you're touching on is you mentioned at the beginning there's almost like an increase, or at least it seems like there's an increase in burnout and just feeling stressed in general for teachers and just as a culture, as a society today. And yeah, there's a couple of things that could be going on, and I think everyone can relate to this in some way. Like, are there more pressures going on? Are there more responsibilities? And are we getting less time? Are we given less resources to do that? What tools do you have in your toolbox already that you can utilize? Are there things that we could be doing with our system, with our teachers to help us? If so, great. But then there's also the sad part that I think you touched on too, is there really just isn't enough time in the day and the demand is higher. So how do you help yourself in that moment, right? When there's maybe something you can't quite control, then it's more, we got to look internal, right? And that's what we have to all look at when we're talking about balancing. How do I help myself in the moment feel okay with what's coming up? right? If that makes sense, without trying to change my environment, because maybe I can't change my environment in that circumstance.
But what
if I don't have control, but what can I do internally to help cope, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense, because we can't control the environment. You know, I can't control the fact that, you know, my students are having a bad day and they want so much from me, and I can't control that there's a fire alarm today and I didn't plan for it, or, you know, then I have a student who has learning needs and they're having a bad day, or if there's a student with severe anxiety and they're having a bad day.
Yeah.
I think as teachers, we have a lot of empathy for our students as well. So how do I also protect myself, but also care about the situation that's happening with my student? You touched on tools that you can use in the classroom.
Yeah, sure. I think it depends first on a couple of things we should highlight. First off, what I would call this toolkit, really essentially what it is almost like a psychological toolkit, right? Because you're basically finding cognitive resiliency. And what I mean by that is internally you are finding some ways to frame the situation, and what that involves first is awareness. So what we have to do always, and this does not just apply to teachers and the specific situation, but in general when we're experiencing stress of any kind, we have to start getting good at recognizing those signs. And what I mean by that is what are my personal triggers and warning signs that I'm getting overwhelmed and stressed in the moment. It could be my heart's racing, my palms are sweaty, my thinking is starting to get cloudy, I'm snapping at my students. Or it might be a little more subtle, right? You might just start to tune out. You might just feel a little sleepy. You might be craving just zoning out at the end of the day. You might just notice your mood dropping. There's so many different things for everyone, but what's important is that you realize what it looks like for you when you're going down.
And you know, that's a really good question, actually, because a lot of us don't actually know until it's too late that we are pushed to that limit. So that could almost be a task one, is taking a step back and trying to think about your limit and trying to think about, okay, what are the signs that I can look for when I'm being pushed to that edge?
Exactly. There's a lot of things, a lot of what we call reframing, and just ways of understanding your situation and your circumstances that help you better manage them. If you don't know why you're feeling a certain way and you don't know what your triggers are, then how can you do anything to help yourself? Usually what happens is we go along our days pretty automatically, so it's almost too late by the time you realize that we were overwhelmed and stressed, like you were touching on, which is why at least people end up burnt out. People start using substances and chemicals to cope. You might go home and you might just shut down.
Might have a glass of wine or two.
Exactly. There's all these things, all these behaviors that we don't really realize are just masks for that underlying stress. So that's really important to start to tune in. And so that's what we just call tuning in, reflecting, awareness, really getting that first, getting that underway. What is it that I'm feeling, and why am I feeling that way?
Wow, that's really challenging, actually, because especially, you know, if you're not used to doing that, and if you're used to being on autopilot, how do you then go, no, I am stressed?
Exactly, and I should just touch on this a little bit too. It takes a lot of work to figure this stuff out. So I don't ever expect anyone to just know this on the top of their head. I've worked on this for years, personally and professionally, with my clients, and I still, to this day, catch myself off guard all the time when I'm feeling stressed, not even knowing why or what's happening. But what the most important thing is that you know that something's off, and at some point down the line, you take some time to reflect on that. Whether it's in the moment, great. But if you're in a classroom and it's happening, it's not the time to probably go, what's going on with me? Let me sit here and breathe, right? That's not realistic either.
So what do we do in those situations?
What I always do is I sort of, when I speak with clients and when I work on this with myself, you want to do sort of a 1, 2, 3 step process. And this is sort of a generic, we apply this to everything. Psychologists apply this to early childhood development with parenting, how to help your children with emotional development. It's all about emotional regulation, essentially. Stop, breathe. Take some time just to breathe. No one has to know that you're breathing or that you're stressed out. Maybe you don't even know you're stressed. Just give yourself a few breaths, right? If you can, remove yourself from the situation that is triggering you, if you know what that is, right? And try your best to either self-soothe, and what I mean by that is distract. So, for example, if it's something you can't control or is happening in the moment, you're starting to notice your blood pressure is rising and you get your heart's going, if you can remove yourself, great. But often if you can't, then it's breath work. It's internalized breath work. It's pausing. It's not reacting. And almost putting it, whatever it is, on the shelf, a psychological shelf. So you're going, okay, name it, label it, and then distract and move forward. So something's not right. Oh, I'm getting triggered. I'm going to take a moment here and breathe. I'm going to put that on the shelf, and I'm going to deal with that later. Right?
Okay, so for example, my students, often when I'm trying to give a lesson, they will start to talk over me, and I've definitely, even like thinking about it now, it's giving me shivers. So that, to me, is a definite trigger for stress.
Yeah.
So in that moment, if students are talking over me and I'm feeling stressed, I should name it. So, okay, I'm feeling stressed.
And that means either to yourself. You don't have to say it out loud.
Out loud, just
or
sort of
just
internally.
acknowledge it so that you're literally acknowledging it to yourself.
Acknowledging that I'm stressed and the reason why.
Yeah,
So,
if you know it. Something's going on. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's what I'm feeling. And then you can move forward. In some way. So if you don't know, to say, my heart's racing. Okay, I'm getting amped up here. Not sure why yet, but something's off, and I'm triggered. Okay, because what that's doing is you're telling yourself that you need to go into your toolkit, and now you need to do the thing to help yourself stay grounded, so that you don't go into that fight or flight response in the moment. Right, because we're getting into crisis management here, because this is another area that I'm passionate about talking about, because it really applies to so many things. But it's when you get angry, anger management, crisis management. It's all those situations where if you're not careful, you actually end up blowing up and reacting. So what we want to avoid is any kind of reaction that's going to actually give you worse consequences that you're going to have to deal with. Right? Because that's the worst part. It's not only now are you stressed, but something that you did to try to manage it backfired on you, and now you're dealing with additional stress.
Right.
And emotional distress and disappointment, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to get at is keeping your cool, finding a way to avoid an overreaction or a reaction that's not warranted in the circumstances, allows you to then park it on the shelf. And then later, when you have time, or when you're in a safer place, you can then process what it is that was going on for you, if that makes any sense. Essentially, I guess this can be applied in so many different ways, but I think it's really important because if we're not aware that things are even happening, then how are we supposed to deal with it overall? And then the situation continues every day, every week. The same thing that triggers you continues to trigger you, and you go home and you're continuously overwhelmed, distressed, and burnt out.
And do you think that could escalate as well? Like if you continue to sort of not ignore it, but not be aware of it.
Yeah, so when you're not aware, you don't know if it's a problem, you don't know that you're stressed, it's going to build. And usually that's what happens is, over time, we develop patterns, and we have trauma in our lives, and we have things that happen to us, and if they're not dealt with, it becomes sort of a quick trigger in the brain. So the brain sees something that's happened, and it reminds you of that first time or the 500 times it happened, and now you're done. You're impatient, you're triggered, you feel the emotional response so heavily that now you're just desperate to make it go away, right? So then that's what happens when we go from a 0 to a 10. When you're angry or stressed, it takes so little, or on the surface it appears that it takes almost nothing to go from a happy place, from a 0, to an I'm raging, I can't cope with this, level 10. Right, so we want to just basically nip that in the bud, so that you don't go to that 10. You might go to the 2 or 3, but then you are managing it by regulating yourself internally, by awareness, by acknowledgement, by labeling, and then creating space and breathing. The most important thing is when I say breathing and grounding, essentially you're just making sure that you're not sending your body into fight or flight. Because as soon as you activate the